Eldritch stepped forward, his boots pressing against the cobblestone streets of the town. The air was thick, suffocating, not with heat, but with something unseen, something heavy. The sky above was locked in perpetual twilight, an abyss of swirling black and crimson, shifting like the breathing of some unseen entity. As he walked, shutters slammed shut, doors creaked and groaned as they were locked from the inside. Figures once visible in windows turned away, vanishing into the dim, candle-lit interiors of their homes. The entire town recoiled from him, as though he were an intruder. The architecture was ancient, untouched by time. Stone houses with thatched roofs, wooden beams weathered with age. There was no electricity, no hum of modern life, only the dim flicker of oil lanterns hanging from rusted hooks, casting elongated shadows that seemed to stretch too far. The people, they were darker still. They moved with an unnatural stillness, their faces gaunt, their eyes hollow. Some wore expressions of resignation, others of quiet fear. These were not mortals, nor were they elders in the way Eldritch had known them to be. They were prisoners, each one carefully selected, hand-picked by Nocturna. Why? Some perhaps had been powerful in life, elders of great renown held in reserve should Nocturna need them. Others, scholars and sages, trapped here for the knowledge they held. And some were simply playthings, trophies of a god's amusement. But none of them spoke to Eldritch. He continued his path through the lifeless streets, the sound of his own footsteps echoing too loudly. The dread of the place seeped into his very bones, a slow, creeping thing that whispered to him in silence. Then ahead he saw it. A house, larger, more prominent than the others, standing at the very heart of the town. Its structure loomed over the smaller buildings, its presence casting a deep, unnatural shadow upon the street. The windows were dark, the door shut tight, but something about it felt alive. Eldritch halted. A chill ran through him, one he had not felt in centuries. Then movement. A woman stood across the street, her form barely illuminated by the dim glow of lanterns. Her face was hidden beneath a tattered veil, her body wrapped in a flowing black dress that moved slightly, though there was no wind. She was staring at him. Eldritch took a step toward her. "Who lives there?" The woman did not answer at first. Her head tilted slightly, as if listening to something far away, something that spoke only to her. Then, in a murmur, soft, distant, and yet filled with something heavy, she whispered, "The beast!" A slow, paralyzing silence filled the space between them. Eldritch felt something shift in the air, an unseen weight pressing against him, as if the very town itself had held its breath. This was no ordinary place. This was no ordinary afterlife. This was a cage for beings who had once been more than gods, now stripped of power, kept as trophies, as pets, as weapons waiting to be unleashed. Eldritch knew what this was. It was Nocturna's collection, and he was now part of it. Eldritch moved towards the large building. The closer he got, the more it stood out. Unlike the rest of the town, which felt abandoned, broken and decayed, this building was different, almost regal, a structure of power standing defiantly in the heart of a village of the damned. He could feel it, the weight of something watching him, waiting. "You there, over here?" A voice, low, urgent. Eldritch turned sharply, his instincts flaring. To his right, a narrow alleyway drowned in darkness, a figure barely visible within. He clenched his fists, feeling the limits of his new, fragile body. He was no longer an elder, no longer untouchable. A trap could mean his end. "Show yourself," Eldritch commanded. The figure hesitated, then stepped forward, just enough to be seen. Eldritch's breath caught. He knew that face. A vampire he had met centuries ago, a powerful elder in his time, now reduced to a frail, nervous man, his once imposing figure hunched as though he carried a weight too great for him. His once brilliant golden eyes had dulled, replaced with something hollow. "Eldritch," the man said, his voice shaking slightly. "It's me, Varos." For the first time since he arrived in this wretched place, Eldritch felt something real. "Varos?" he murmured, stepping forward, his caution fading for a moment. Varos nodded quickly. "Come, not here." Eldritch followed as Varos led him through the twisting streets of the town, moving like a man always expecting danger. They stopped at a small, decrepit house, tucked between two other worn-down buildings. The door creaked as they entered, and inside, the room was simple. A wooden table, a few chairs, a fireplace, where a small flame struggled to fight off the eternal cold of Nocturna's realm. Varos gestured for Eldritch to sit, taking a seat across from him near the fire. "You look terrible," Eldritch said, studying his old acquaintance. Varos let out a dry laugh. "You should have seen me in the feeding grounds. Compared to that nightmare, this place is merciful." His expression darkened, and then, almost mechanically, he added, "Nocturna is merciful. He is powerful. We are grateful to share this place. We praise Nocturna and his mercy." Eldritch's eyes narrowed. The way Varos said it was unnatural, rehearsed, forced. "So," Eldritch said slowly, watching Varos's reaction, "he knows everything that happens here, I take it?" Varos gave a slow, deliberate nod. Silence fell between them for a moment. The fire crackled weakly. Then Varos sighed, rubbing his face, as if the very act of speaking was exhausting. "How did you get here, Eldritch?" Eldritch exhaled, leaning back in his chair. "Cithrus!" Varos flinched at the name. "Ah, so he finally got you too." "Yes." Eldritch glanced at the fire. "And I suppose we all end up here, one way or another. The cycle continues." Varos gave a bitter chuckle. "Yes, the cycle." They sat in silence, the weight of the afterlife pressing against them both. Then Eldritch finally asked, "Who lives in that house? The large one at the centre of town?" Varos's expression darkened. His hands tightened into fists, his knuckles pale. He looked away from Eldritch, staring into the flickering flames. "Do not go there, Eldritch," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Eldritch leaned forward. "Why?" Varos swallowed. "The beast." The room felt colder at those words. "Many come here, Eldritch," Varos continued, his voice hollow. "But many also disappear. We know it's him. He takes them, and once they are taken, they do not return." Eldritch watched Varos carefully. Even now, without his powers, Varos let out a shaky breath. "Even as a man, he is mad with bloodlust." His voice dropped lower. "The thirst never left him, and he takes it out on those trapped here." A shadow passed over Varos's face. Fear, real fear. Eldritch leaned back, his fingers drumming against the wooden table. So Nocturna collected elders, kept them, shaped them, perhaps even prepared them for something. But this was different. This was something he had to see for himself. After a long silence, Eldritch finally spoke. "I need to go there." Varos's face darkened, his eyes filling with something between fear and resignation. "Eldritch," he said quietly, "don't. This is not my fate," Eldritch continued, standing. "And Nocturna knows it. He put me here to go and confront this so-called beast, and so I will." Varos exhaled slowly, shaking his head. "Be careful," he muttered. "He is not like us. I think he was evil before he became an elder. Even today, many go missing in the night. We know he tortures them, kills them." Varos swallowed. "He does it to satisfy an urge." Eldritch met his gaze. Then that urge must be answered. Varos didn't argue. There was no point. He simply sighed, nodding once. And so Eldritch left, walking alone through the town's lifeless streets, heading toward the house at its centre. Far above, unseen by mortal eyes, Nocturna watched. A slow, wicked smile stretched across his lips as he observed the scene below. He had known this confrontation was inevitable. It was in Eldritch's nature to seek out the truth, just as it was in his nature to watch. It was all a game, and Nocturna loved his games. Eldritch reached the house. Stepping onto the worn stone steps, he raised a fist and banged on the heavy wooden door. For a long moment there was silence, then shouting. A muffled voice, deep and furious, roaring something unintelligible. Beneath it, the unmistakable sound of screaming, agony. A person in pain. The door creaked open. A woman stood before him, drained. Her body was covered in bruises, her arms wrapped in old scars, her lips split and barely healed. She had the look of someone long past fear, someone who had learned that fear meant nothing when there was no escape. Eldritch met her empty gaze. "I wish to see the owner of this place." She hesitated, then gave a small shake of her head, a warning. Then from deep within the house, a booming voice. "Let him in." The woman swallowed hard, stepping aside. Eldritch entered. The air inside was thick, heavy with something rotten. The floors, once polished wood, were stained, not with blood, but with something darker, something sickly. The flickering firelight barely illuminated the walls, which were lined with old ruined banners, as though the house had once belonged to a warrior of great renown. A massive chair faced the fireplace, a hulking figure seated within it, his form hidden in the shadows. A voice, deep, amused, unhinged. "Come, Eldritch," the figure said. "He told me you would come." Eldritch stepped forward, his body tensed as his gaze fixed on the man before him. Then realization. The figure rose from the chair, tall, broad shoulders, muscles rippling beneath the tattered shirt stretched across his frame. A thick, tangled beard covered his face, and his eyes, wild and burning with something dark, locked onto Eldritch with recognition. He moved with the ease of a warrior from an age long past, a relic of brutality given form, a voice thick with a Scottish accent. "Come, sit by my fire." Eldritch's breath caught in his throat. He knew this man, and he spoke his name in a whisper. "Duncan McDruston." Duncan laughed, a deep, guttural sound, filled with madness. Before Eldritch could respond, his gaze drifted downward. A man lay crumpled on the floor, beaten, blooded, broken. Duncan snarled, "Get out of here! Can't you see we have a guest?" The beaten man scrambled away, crawling with what little strength he had left. He disappeared into the darkness, his ragged breathing the only proof he was still alive. Duncan followed Eldritch's gaze, chuckling darkly. "This place is perfect, Eldritch," he said, his tone filled with something deeply unsettling. "They're already dead. No matter what you do to them, they don't die. It's almost heaven." His grin widened, his teeth yellowed and sharp. "I can beat them as hard as I want, tear them apart, but they never die. Never." His words trailed into something incoherent, muttered, a slur of ramblings that carried the weight of a man utterly consumed by madness. Eldritch remained still, watching him carefully. Duncan's laughter echoed through the room, his head tilting slightly. "He keeps me here, you know. He teases me with these playthings. But one day—" His fingers twitched, his massive hands curling into fists. "One day, he will free me back into the world, where I will fulfill my destiny." He looked at Eldritch now, his eyes gleaming. "You should have seen us, Eldritch, Azrael and I." His voice grew nostalgic. "We were a force of pure destruction." Eldritch nodded slowly. "I have heard of your exploits, Master." Duncan froze. The room went still. Then slowly, ever so slowly, he turned his gaze fully upon Eldritch. "No one has called me that for a long time," Duncan muttered, his voice quieter. "Not since—" Then his face changed. Recognition. "Wait," Duncan said. His lips curled, his teeth grinding together. "He was a friend of yours, wasn't he?" Eldritch remained silent. Duncan sneered. "That no-good cheating elder." A pulse of rage passed over his face, his nostrils flaring. "He cheated in our fight." Duncan growled. "I won. I beat them all. No one defeats the Master. No one." His roar shook the room, his entire body trembling, his muscles flexing, as if preparing to lash out at something unseen. Eldritch's sharp eyes didn't miss it. The way Duncan twitched, his hands clenching and unclenching, his shoulders hunched forward like an addict craving his next dose. He needed something. Duncan turned, snapping his fingers. A frail servant appeared instantly, and without hesitation, Duncan struck, a savage blow sending the servant sprawling. Another strike, and another. The man collapsed to the ground, twitching, his body barely clinging to life, and Duncan only smiled. Something dark and wet splattered across his face. He inhaled deeply, savouring it. His hands trembled. His breath came in ragged, hungry gasps. Eldritch watched. Duncan McDruston was not a warrior. He was not even a man. He was something else, something twisted, something wrong. And as Duncan turned back to him, grinning through bloodied teeth, Eldritch knew one thing. This was not just a confrontation. This was a reckoning. Eldritch watched cautiously. Duncan's movements were unpredictable, his mind shifting from madness to laughter and back again in the space of a breath. The massive warrior paced, speaking with the confidence of a man who believed himself unbreakable. Eldritch studied him, then finally spoke. "So how will he send you back?" Duncan roared with laughter, a booming, guttural sound. His entire body shook with it, as if the very question was absurd. From a crazed man to a jovial one in seconds. "He will send me back," Duncan said, grinning, "when the job cannot be done by the weak, when the world requires the strongest, the unstoppable. That is when he will call for me." Eldritch nodded slowly, his mind calculating. Then, risking much, he replied, "Nocturna told me something different." Duncan's expression froze. Eldritch continued, his voice measured. "He told me he cannot send anyone back, that to do so would upset the balance, and to upset the balance would bring the keeper of the balance to Nocturna's door." Silence. Duncan's fingers twitched. His entire body went rigid. "He promised me my return," Duncan said, his voice quiet but dangerous. "He does not lie." "I do not think he does," Eldritch replied carefully. "After all, he told me the truth." Duncan said nothing. His jaw tightened, his breathing shallow and sharp. Then, without warning, he smiled again. "Come, Eldritch," Duncan said. "Follow me." Eldritch hesitated, then walked alongside him. They left the house, stepping into the cold, twilight-lit streets. The town was silent as they passed, doors locked, windows shut tight. The people knew better than to watch whatever Duncan McDruston was doing. They reached the edge of town, where the eternal feeding ground of Nocturna's realm met the land of the village. Eldritch's eyes narrowed. There, piled upon each other, hundreds of bodies, not dead, not alive either. They squirmed, shifting in endless agony, their flesh writhing, melting, dissolving at an impossible pace. Faces frozen in silent screams, limbs twisting into the black crimson of Nocturna's feeding ground, and Duncan, with the glee of a madman, pointed. "There," he said, voice filled with satisfaction. "He sends them to me. I cannot kill the already dead." He grinned wider, his eyes alight with something feral. "But I can put them here, and watch them slowly dissolve." Eldritch felt the weight of those words. This was entertainment to Duncan, the suffering of others, his amusement. Duncan tilted his head slightly, his massive form looming over Eldritch. "I wonder, Eldritch," he mused, his tone shifting, growing low and hungry. Did he send you here, so that I may do the same to you?" Eldritch did not move, did not react, because in that moment he knew Duncan was testing him, and if he showed fear, he would not walk away. Eldritch calculated his response carefully. Duncan was unpredictable, teetering between madness and aggression. A single wrong word, a misstep in tone, and the brute would turn on him like a rabid beast. He took a slow breath and spoke, his voice calm, unwavering. "Force should never be initiated against another," Eldritch began. "To do so is to abandon reason in favour of brute power. A man who chooses to use force as his first means of action has already surrendered his mind. He admits, without speaking, that he has no way to convince others, that his will alone is insufficient." Duncan squinted, his large, scarred hands curling into fists as he tried to grasp Eldritch's words. "But a man who is prepared to use force in return, that is a different matter entirely," Eldritch continued, watching Duncan's reaction. "For such a man does not seek violence, but understands its necessity. He will act only when he must, when there is no other choice. And when he does..." Eldritch's voice grew colder, sharper. "The outcome is always terrible." Duncan stood there, staring, trying to understand. He did not fully grasp Eldritch's words, but he felt them. Something about them rang true in his core. Even if his mind couldn't shape the meaning, he had to either agree or admit that Eldritch was his superior, and that was something a man like Duncan could never do. So instead, he simply grunted and motioned for Eldritch to return to the house. They walked in silence for a time, the weight of the conversation settling between them. Duncan's shoulders seemed to relax, if only slightly. He exhaled through his nose, thinking, then spoke. "So why, then?" he asked, his tone quieter now. "Do you think he sent you to me?" Eldritch glanced at him. "Do you think he wants to see who is strongest?" A trap. Eldritch knew instantly. If he said yes, Duncan would attack him on the spot. If he said no, Duncan would believe it a lie, a ruse meant to disarm him. So Eldritch did what he always did. He adapted. He lied. "I am weak," Eldritch said plainly. "The last real battle I fought, I lost. I doubt one as intelligent as Nocturna would consider me a replacement for you." Duncan considered this, narrowing his eyes. Then Eldritch added, carefully placing the next piece of the game. "But," Duncan grunted, "but what?" Eldritch turned to him. "I have spent much time with the Keeper of the Balance. Perhaps Nocturna is seeking another way to send his strongest back." A double rebuttal, a subtle redirection, leaving Duncan with no opening. If he rejected the idea, he would be calling himself weak. If he accepted it, it meant Nocturna still had a purpose for him. Duncan exhaled, outsmarted, and simply nodded as they continued walking. Far above them, Nocturna watched. He did not care for either of these two men. He did not care who was stronger or who was weaker. He simply enjoyed the game. A day passed. Eldritch remained in Duncan's home, a guest in a house that reeked of violence and madness. Even in the quiet of his room, he could hear the beatings, the screams, new voices, each carrying fresh agony. It did not stop. Duncan's hunger for destruction was insatiable. Then, silence. Not just a pause between the suffering. Something else. Something unnatural. Eldritch sat still, listening. In the absence of sound, he thought. He planned. What would Winter do? Winter, a mere man, had defeated gods. Not with strength, not with power, but with knowledge, precision. Eldritch exhaled slowly. I must pull from that. A knock on the door. Eldritch turned. Once again, the battered woman stood there, her eyes hollow, her body trembling. She did not speak. She simply gestured for him to follow. Without a word, he rose and obeyed. She led him downward, beneath the house, into a vast underground hall. Larger than it should be. The ceilings stretched high, flickering torchlight, casting eerie shadows across the stone walls. Seated around the edges of the hall were 20 or so men and women, clearly of high standing in this wretched place. Elders, stripped of power, but still clinging to whatever remnants of authority they could claim. And in the centre of the hall, Duncan. The woman gestured for Eldritch to sit. He did, and he watched. A man was pushed into the centre of the hall. He stumbled, barely able to keep his footing. A sacrifice. Duncan turned, grinning. Without hesitation, he attacked. The man did not stand a chance. Duncan's ferocity was unmatched. Pure power. His fists landed with sickening cracks, his laughter echoing through the chamber as the man was beaten to the ground, broken, unable to fight back. Then, a voice. No, no. Eldritch's stomach dropped. Varos, his old friend, was shoved forward, forced into the centre of the hall. A new opponent. Eldritch's eyes narrowed. This is a trap. They wanted to drag him into the fray, to force him to fight Duncan, to break him in front of the others. Eldritch's mind raced. Think, Eldritch, think. Winter, what would you do? Winter would already have the solution. Duncan raised his fists, ready to end Varos, and then Eldritch stood, his voice cut through the room like a blade. Pathetic. Silence. Every eye turned to him. Eldritch stepped forward. What kind of fight is this, when no one can actually die? His voice was sharp, filled with mockery. We are in the realm of Nocturna, and I see children playing with toys. Compared to the way we once hunted, compared to the way we killed, this is nothing. The room was dead silent. Duncan's fists clenched. Rage, confusion. He wanted to strike Eldritch down, but could not find the reason. Finally, someone in the crowd spoke. What do you suggest? Eldritch calculated. Every move had to be precise. He exhaled slowly. Something where there is at least a chance of destruction. His gaze swept over the gathered elders. This is like a child's playground, a game with no real stakes. We, who have fed on millions, are reduced to watching pretend battles. Some in the crowd muttered in agreement. Duncan was raging. I'll fight anyone, even you, Eldritch. Eldritch smirked. And what would that prove? Neither of us can die. We have already died once. A second voice called out. Then what do you suggest? Eldritch let the silence linger. Then he spoke. I've only been here a short time, but it seems to me that in this place, no matter what happens, we will not die. He let the words sink in. But out there, he turned his head towards the entrance, toward the eternal feeding grounds. Out there is a chance you won't come back. Murmurs spread through the gathered elders. Some stiffened, some leaned forward with curiosity. Eldritch continued, I suggest a hunt. The crowd stilled. Eldritch's voice was measured, confident. 2 enter. 1 comes back. The other is consumed. Silence. Then the crowd erupted. Shouts, cheers, excitement. Yes, some called. The hunt, the hunt. Duncan grinned. I will leave my opponent broken, unable to return in moments. Eldritch stood tall. Not him? The crowd went silent again. Duncan's grin faltered. Eldritch locked eyes with him. Me. Duncan's lips curled, his fists tightened. Then slowly, he smiled. A slow, twisted grin. This was not anger. This was excitement. Far above them, unseen by mortal eyes, Nocturna watched. He laughed. Eldritch stood at the edge of the feeding grounds, staring into the endless expanse of shifting, parasitic blood that pulsed beneath a sky of swirling black and crimson. Beside him, Varos was tense, his face twisted with frustration. This is madness, Eldritch, he muttered. You should have let me take the beating. I would have survived. Eldritch turned slightly, his expression unreadable. This has to stop, Varos continued. We are elders, not playthings. Eldritch smirked. I agree. Varos frowned. Then why are you going through with this? Eldritch exhaled slowly. Because I have a plan. He looked back at the gathered crowd, the 20 or so elders standing at the edge of the feeding grounds, their faces lit by flickering torches. They were eager for blood, for entertainment. Only one could come back. The other would be trapped forever, consumed by the feeding grounds, just like the thousands of souls writhing beneath the surface. Eldritch turned back toward the abyss. I will leave first. Duncan's gaze snapped to him, his fists clenched so tightly his knuckles cracked. Give me 10 minutes, Eldritch continued. Then come after me, Duncan, if you dare. Duncan's body trembled, unstable. Eldritch could see it, the uncontrollable rage boiling beneath the surface, barely contained. If Duncan caught him, that would be the end of Eldritch. He could not fight Duncan, not physically, but who needs to fight when they have intellect? Eldritch stepped forward, his boots sinking slightly into the sickly, pulsing terrain of the feeding grounds. He turned his head one last time and smirked. 10 minutes, Duncan? Then come meet me for the fight of your life, master. Duncan's body shook violently, his muscles twitching, his face twisting into something inhuman. He was beyond rage. Eldritch could hear his ragged, boiling breath, could see the veins bulging along his thick arms. Duncan could hardly contain himself, like a volcano ready to explode. And as Eldritch ran out into the feeding grounds, disappearing into the shifting abyss, he whispered to himself, Now let's see how well you play my game. Eldritch ran, the endless mass of black-crimson flesh pulling at his boots, threatening to drag him under. He could already feel the feeding grounds draining him, leeching his essence like a parasite. Pace yourself, Eldritch, he told himself. Don't panic. Don't rush. Behind him, Duncan was a raging storm, his howls splitting the unnatural sky, his footsteps like thunder. I'm coming for you, Eldritch. You will die screaming. Eldritch forced himself to keep moving, his mind already set on his plan. He remembered a particular area, one that had caught his attention when he first travelled through this wretched place. A mass of congealed bodies, half devoured by the feeding ground. The terrain was unstable, a place where the dead did not simply sink, but were pulled under by the collective agony of those already trapped. Eldritch, smaller, faster, lighter, could navigate it. Duncan, massive, unstoppable, blinded by bloodlust, would not. The ground shifted beneath him, tendrils of melted bodies stretching toward him, hungry. Eldritch jumped over them, his boots barely finding enough stability to keep moving forward. The closer he got, the more the land pulled at him, sensing new prey. Move, Eldritch. Move before you get pulled under. The moment he passed the unstable ground, he stopped. Now on firmer terrain, he turned, waiting. His breath was ragged, his body weakened, his energy being fed upon even now. But he smiled, because Duncan had arrived. Duncan sprinted, eyes bloodshot, his rage consuming every thought. He did not see the trap, did not feel the ground shifting beneath him. He only saw Eldritch, standing, mocking him. With full force, Duncan charged, and his pace slowed. Step by step, his massive frame weighed him down. The ground clung to him, wrapping around his boots, his shins, his knees, swallowing him. Eldritch watched as Duncan struggled, his mind lost to the frenzy of bloodlust. Yet, the more he fought, the faster he sank. Then Duncan stopped. For the first time, perhaps ever, he was stuck. Eldritch stepped forward slightly, smirking. I knew Nocturna favoured me over a brute. Duncan's eyes snapped up, pure mindless hatred consuming him. Eldritch continued, voice calm, measured, cutting. He was never going to send you back, Duncan. Why do you think he kept you here all this time? If he truly wanted to return you to the world, he would have done it already. He would not have sent me. Duncan roared, thrashing, but his struggles only sank him deeper. The black crimson mass climbed to his waist, yet his power never faded, his strength never wavered. He would struggle until the end. Eldritch let the words drip from his tongue like poison. I walked over this land like a cat, Duncan, yet Nocturna holds you down. Why is that? Duncan's body writhed harder, his every movement an explosion of pure fury, but it only helped him sink faster. Chest, shoulders, only his head remained above the surface. Eldritch tilted his head back, as if speaking to the sky itself. I have done what you asked, Nocturna. I have disposed of this one, the one you were bored with. Now you can send me back. Duncan froze. His mind, clouded by rage, suddenly registered the words. The realization hit him like a hammer. Nocturna, you lied to me. His final scream was not of rage, but betrayal. I will destroy you. And then the ground consumed him. His head disappeared, leaving only the rippling abyss in his wake. Eldritch stood for a moment, staring at the place Duncan had been. Then, without looking back, he turned and walked toward the town. Above, unseen, Nocturna laughed. Eldritch emerged from the feeding grounds, stepping onto solid land once more. The warmth of the torches greeted him, their flickering light, a stark contrast to the consuming darkness he had left behind. A moment of silence. Then, you did it! Varos rushed to him, grabbing him by the shoulders. His eyes shone with relief, with disbelief. And then the others cheered. We are free of him! The 20 elders, who had once watched the fight, erupted into celebration, their voices calling his name. Eldritch! 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 Doors opened in the town. Laughter rang out. Laughter that had not been heard in centuries. Men and women, once proud elders, reduced to shadows of themselves, now stepped from their homes. Freed from the grip of the master, they celebrated, clapped him on the back, praised him. Eldritch forced a smile, but he felt nothing, because he knew better than them. Meanwhile, in the feeding grounds, the black-crimson mass swirled violently, its surface shifting, unsettled. Then a hand, a massive, battle-worn hand, plunged through the abyss. It gripped something, and with effortless strength, it pulled. From the depths of the feeding ground, an unconscious Duncan McDruston was dragged free, limp, broken, defeated, and yet not lost. A figure loomed over him, his presence twisting the air itself, bending reality. Nocturna. His form was human, or at least something close to it, tall, slender, his eyes twin pits of infinite night. He looked down at Duncan's body with an expression of mock sympathy, brushing the filth from his champion's ruined armour. He sighed. "Oh dear," he mused. "Twice now have you failed me." His voice was amused, but not unkind. He knelt beside Duncan, tapping his cheek lightly, as if waking a sleeping child. "But I cannot let you go, my champion." He ran his fingers across Duncan's chest, tracing invisible patterns, feeling the remains of his shattered power. "No, no," Nocturna whispered. "You are far too valuable for that." He turned his head slightly, as if looking into something unseen, something beyond mortal perception. "Come, rest with Azrael, away from them, away from those who would mock you." A snap of his fingers, and Duncan's broken body vanished, swallowed by the shadows. Nocturna stood, dusting off his hands, looking toward the town, toward Eldritch. And he smiled. "Now, we shall need to find another challenge for this Eldritch." His laughter was soft, but it carried through the entire realm. End. Part 3. Coming soon.